Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning into my talk, and a big thank you to the organizers of the Diagrams, Image Retrieval, and Analysis Workshop at CVPR for inviting me to be one of their speakers. My name is Ranjay Krishna. I am a Stanford PhD candidate, and my aim for the next 30 minutes is to convince you of the representational power of scene graphs for a wide variety of modalities, ranging from visual diagrams to real images, videos, and even language. So let's start off by taking a look at tasks that people are working on within the space of diagrams, data plots, and charts. Over the last decade, these tasks have expanded to be more useful for users. We're not only classifying diagrams into various categories, but are also building models to extract components from them, retrieving data plots by allowing users to search for and modify the underlying structure of those plots, and even answering open-ended questions about diagrams. While these tasks have become useful, they have also become more complex, requiring more data, more human interaction, and complicated modeling choices. One interesting theme, however, across all of these tasks is this underlying structure. For all of these tasks, models must learn to recognize and ground the elements, objects, or data entities, such as points, patches, labels, ticks, etc. They also need to understand the attributes associated with each entity, for instance, the size or the color of a point, whether it's a number, the length of the bars. And finally, they also need to reason about the relationships between those entities. For instance, the absolute and relative spatial locations between the entities and their associations between categories and values, the density between patches, and other kinds of relationships. Now let's move over to the domain of real images and videos. The field has been developing models for very similar kinds of tasks. Instead of diagram classification, we're studying action recognition. Instead of extracting components, we extract objects. And similarly, we're also studying retrieval and question answering models. And just like the other domain, in the domain of real images and videos as well, these tasks share a very similar underlying structure. Across many of these tasks, models need to ground the objects like cups, ball, bed, skateboard, etc. They also need to recognize the attributes associated with those objects, the size, the color, the textures, the materials. And finally, models need to reason over the relationships between pairs of objects. For example, which person is kicking the ball versus which person is guarding the goal. I'm here to show you how computer vision tasks have benefited from utilizing this compositional, interpretable, symbolic underlying structure, and how perhaps we can utilize similar representations for diagram understanding. So let's start off by defining and formalizing this underlying representation. We do that using a structure called a scene graph. A scene graph encodes every image as a set of objects grounded as bounding boxes, as well as attributes associated with each one of those objects, and finally, with relationships between pairs of objects. This is an example of a real scene graph from the visual genome dataset, and as you can see, scene graphs are dense, they're structured, they're compositional, and they're a nice knowledge representation. Now, this representation draws inspiration not just from the underlying structure that's shared amongst computer vision tasks, but also has deep roots in cognitive science. A paper in 1998, for example, by Jeremy Wolf, studied how we encode visual memory. From their experiments with people, they concluded that people aren't representing scenes purely as a collection of objects, but are also encoding the relationships between them. Similarly, Irving Biederman in 1982 concluded that people noticed violations of expected attributes of an object within 150 milliseconds. For example, people immediately noticed that a person should not be transparent. They also concluded that people take longer to classify objects into categories, and if they violate these categories, then it takes people longer to identify the objects associated with those relationships. For example, the fire hydrant should not be on top of the mailbox, and this causes us to actually identify objects at a much slower rate. So in 2017, we released the visual genome dataset with 108,000 scene graphs with millions of objects, attributes, and relationships. And this was the very first dataset for scene graphs that was released. With this representation of scene graphs, with this formalization for representing visual inputs, we could now start drawing on ideas from information, social, economic, and communication networks. Behind many of these systems in social science, physics, economics, and biology, they also have this intricate underlying structure, a network that defines the kinds of interactions between the components, and we share that same sort of underlying structure, or at least a structure that's similar. So to promote such interdisciplinary sharing of ideas, we introduced the task of scene graph generation, where given any input, models must produce a structured representation of that image input and encode the relationships between all the grounded objects as bounding boxes. As models have evolved for this task of scene graph generation over the last couple of years, we have shown that you can utilize scene graphs to improve image retrieval, where given any long, complex sentence description, we can convert that description into a scene graph and then ground that scene graph into our training set or retrieval set and retrieve the right images for that given query sentence. Recently, we've also shown that understanding these relationships can also improve object localization. Even though detecting small objects like the ball is really hard to do in this image, knowing that there's a person kicking the ball provides enough contextual clues that focus our model's ability to reason about where the ball must be. Similarly, these techniques help us enable instance localization, where the model localizes people differently depending on whether the person is kicking the ball or guarding the goal. But more importantly, scene graphs provide a compositional structure that enable few-shot prediction. By looking at examples of people riding horses and people wearing hats, we can now build models that can compose these individual objects and relationships to detect completely novel compositions. In this example, being able to detect when a horse is wearing a hat, even though it might have never seen that in its training set. So over the last few years, the field of scene graphs has blossomed to incorporate ideas from numerous fields with techniques ranging from message passing to reinforcement learning to graph convolutions. And this is by far not a comprehensive list. One thing we did start noticing last year, though, is that a lot of these methods for scene graph understanding were focused primarily on the most commonly or frequently occurring types of relationships, like cars on the street and dogs riding a skateboard. However, relationships in the real world follow a long-tail distribution where majority of relationships occur very infrequently and are really not represented in any sort of training set we might hope to collect. So a lot of these models were ignoring some of the most infrequently occurring relationships, for example, elephants drinking milk or dogs riding surfboards, which are hard to find online and so therefore are not represented in our training sets. So noticing this, we investigated ways of automatically labeling large amounts of relationships in unlabeled images. We noticed that with just a few examples, we can represent relationships as simple categorical and spatial features. Categorical features for a relationship, for example, a relationship like eat, would encode that people would eat objects like pizza, food, and animals like giraffes would eat objects like leaves. And spatial features would encode the relative locations of objects when they're participating in that given relationship. For example, the thing you're eating is usually below you and is smaller than the subject eating it. So with these sort of simple categorical and spatial features, we developed a weak supervision framework at ICCV 2019 that automatically labels images with relationships. And then you can use any any scene graph model to train on this automatically generated set of labels. Our method starts off with using just a few examples, so usually in the order of 5 to 10 examples, from which we can extract these categorical and spatial features. And then we use these features to auto-generate noisy heuristics. These heuristics explain how these features can be used to predict whether a relationship exists or not. An example of a heuristic could be if an object is below the subject, then the subject is likely eating that object. Now, of course, that's not always true, and these heuristics are often wrong. So we develop a generative model, a factor graph-based generative model that takes in the outputs of all of these heuristics and uses them to aggregate and fix the errors and understand which heuristics are incorrect for which kinds of relationships. So once we train this generative model, we are now ready to start labeling a large amount of unlabeled data. So we take a lot of unlabeled images, use Mask-RCNN to extract object detections, and then we extract these categorical and spatial features from pairs of these detected objects and feed them to our generative model. Our generative model can now generate probabilistic labels using these aggregated heuristics to label all of these pairs of objects with probabilities of how likely a relationship is to exist or not. Now, with this large amount of data, we can train any scene graph model. And we show through our experiments that unlike other few-shot learning methods like transfer learning, our method approaches almost oracle performance, where oracle measures training on the entire visual genome dataset. The mistakes that our approach makes are also very telling. We found that mistakes usually occur when the categorical or spatial features were insufficient to explain the variability of a relationship. For example, in part C here, we see that the model predicts that the shirt is sitting on a chair when it should have predicted hanging on a chair, but it has only seen people hanging on bars in its training set. So it's, and people are usually hanging below the bar when they're hanging on something. So it's hard for it to generalize to a situation where the shirt is hanging on something, and when it's performing that action, it is on top of the thing it's hanging from. So to probe further the importance of representing this variability of a relationship, we defined a notion of complexity. A relationship is considered more complex if it participates in more relationships with more categories and in more spatial orientations. And we found that the model's performance is in fact directly correlated with the number of subtypes or the complexity of that relationship, suggesting that some relationships are in fact easier to model than others, and that if we were to build few-shot learning methods for relationships, we need to understand the complexity of that relationship and make sure that we have a representative enough size in our labeled set that can then generalize to a lot of unlabeled images. So today, the task of scene graph generation has inspired models to go beyond just generating scene graphs, but utilizing these generated scene graphs for a whole host of core computer vision tasks, including 3D understanding, explainable AI, understanding human intentions, social relationships, and even generating images and programs and answering questions. Inspired by all of this progress, we are publishing a paper at CVPR 2020 this year that extends the scene graph representation into the temporal domain as spatio-temporal scene graphs. This representation encodes scene graphs as they change over time as people perform actions. So here you can take a look at an example where as we move on further in the scene, the graph itself is evolving over time. We're releasing the first large-scale data set that treats actions as compositions of spatio-temporal scene graph labels, and this data set contains 10,000 videos with 500,000 objects grounded in these videos with 1.7 million relationships. Using this data set, we also propose a method in our paper for few-shot action recognition using existing scene graph generation models to generate these scene graphs for every frame of the video. So our model starts off by generating these scene graphs for every single frame. And then next we encode all of the scene graphs into a latent representation that then fuses them into a feature bank. Along another branch, we also encode 3D CNN features, which we then combine and fuse together with our feature bank operations to finally predict the actions that are taking place at different points in the video. We show in our paper that explicitly modeling these scene graphs can lead to improvements in detecting actions against recently proposed strong baselines using as few as 5 to 10 examples per action. Our method in our paper doesn't even innovate on the temporal aspect of scene graphs and utilizes off-the-shelf scene graph models that people have been using thus far. And so we expect this number to improve a lot further, and we expect a lot of future work that actually incorporates these spatio-temporal transformations of these scene graphs into better action recognition models. So it's worth taking a look at how explicitly modeling scene graphs improves our ability to understand actions better. Let's use this video as an example. Here, a person is initially lying in bed and then awakens and finally holds their pillow. Now, a baseline model from last year, when run on this video, would initially predict lying on the bed correctly, but then it incorrectly predicts that the person is watching television, because in the training set, whenever people are lying on their bed, they're often watching television. However, when we run our model on this data, our model doesn't make this mistake. It correctly identifies that the person is waking up, and it does this by explicitly modeling that the person was lying on the bed, and that relationship changes to sitting on the bed. And similarly, initially the model was, so the person was in contact with the pillow, and later on is not. So with these sort of improvements in mind, let's sort of talk a little bit about some more complex tasks like VQA or question answering. Question answering has come a long way in the field of computer vision over the last couple of years. And again, it's possible now to answer a whole host of different kinds of questions. However, if you look underneath the hood, one of their shortcomings is their reliance on the static predefined vocabulary of concepts. When a model is presented with an image containing a concept it has not previously seen, for example, this red panda here, they don't have a mechanism to go out, gather new knowledge. Instead, they have to choose between their predefined set of categories. And so we see a lot of failures happening when question answering models are deployed in the real world, because they are reliant on the static set. So one of the things that we were interested in exploring was this idea behind developing mechanisms that enable models to use this underlying representation, the scene graph representation, to ask questions and even discover new concepts. For instance, to learn about objects, an ideal model would ask questions like, what is a person throwing? Or to learn about attributes, it would ask, what materials are those white pants made of? And finally, to learn about relationships, it would ask questions like, what is the person on the right doing with the frisbee? Unfortunately, existing image-to-sequence models or image-to-question models, both variational and non-variational versions of these models, suffer from producing generic questions that can be asked of any image. These models quickly learn a shortcut that minimizes the maximum likelihood loss that is often used to train these models, and they end up producing generic questions like, what color is the grass? Or what color is the sky? A question that you can ask for almost any image, and would reduce the loss, but would lose this variability that's actually useful. It would stop asking questions that are actually useful for the model to generate, to learn new concepts. So in a paper last year, we formalized this notion of question generation by formalizing it as an information maximization optimization. Our formulation attempts to maximize the mutual information between the image and the question we want to generate, as well as the mutual information between the expected answer and the question we want to generate. This formulation, however, has two technical challenges. The first is that the optimization is intractable because mutual information is non-differentiable with discrete tokens, and discrete tokens come from the fact that we're generating words, and no unbiased low variance estimator exists. Finally, this formulation itself will also produce an impractical model, because there's no point in generating a question if we need to know the answer in order to be able to generate the question. We tackle the first of these two challenges by reformulating our optimization by introducing a continuous latent variable z and maximizing the mutual information between z and all three of our components, the image, the expected answer, and the question we want to generate. We can reformulate this objective by using the evidence lower bound, and again, check our paper for more details, but essentially it allows us to get around this process of intractability because we no longer have this discrete tokenization problem. We're now trying to maximize the mutual information with respect to this continuous latent Z space. And essentially, this formulation equates the following model. Given an image and an answer, we encode both of them into a representation and use them to project onto the Z space. And from that Z space, we maximize the lower bound of mutual information by attempting to recreate the image representation, as well as the answer representation that was used to encode into that Z space. Next, we also attempt to maximize the likelihood of generating the correct ground truth question in our training set using your standard maximum likelihood estimation. This formulation is still impractical, of course, because we still need to know the answer in order to generate that question. And so to overcome the second challenge, we introduce another space, the T space, that encodes the image and the type of knowledge we are hoping to learn. It encodes whether the answer we want is an object, an attribute, or a relationship into a variable C, and we use that variable C and the image representation to encode into a space T. And then we minimize the KL divergence between the T space and the Z space. So in total, we have these 4 losses in place, and we train our entire model. And then when it's done training, during inference, we can directly generate questions not just from the Z space, but also from the T space. In fact, we don't even need the answer anymore after we're done training this model. We can get rid of the bottom half of our model and only use the image and feed in the category of the type of thing we want to learn, whether we want to generate questions about objects, attributes, or relationships. Although our contributions are agnostic to the underlying architecture of the encoder and decoder we use a standard LSTM to decode our questions, a one-hot encoding architecture to represent the type of answers we want to learn, and a convolutional neural network. We use a ResNet variant, I think it was ResNet 18, to encode our images. And then finally, we use a bidirectional LSTM to encode our answers. Once trained, our model can not only generate questions about objects and attributes and relationships. In our paper, we show that you can extend this to ask questions about counting, for example, asking how many questions, or asking binary questions like, is this a busy street, or is the man wearing a hat? It can also ask about colors, like what color is something. It can ask about materials, like what is something made out of. It can ask about shapes, about the location of where a photo was taken, etc. So this allows us to specifically figure out the kind of information or knowledge we want to learn and focus our model's question generation ability to try to gain that kind of knowledge. So again, learning this underlying representation allows us to direct our models to gain knowledge that we actually want and avoid the problem of generating these generic questions which are not useful. So overall, I hope I've convinced you that there are a lot of benefits of understanding this underlying structure in our problems using an appropriate symbolic representation. For our case, for real images, we used a scene graph representation, showed all the different ways in which you can enable few-shot learning or generating questions or understanding actions. Such representations allow us to disconnect perception from reasoning, enabling simpler modular components in our models. Such decomposition can aid both few-shot learning as well as allow us to build interpretable, decomposable models. Finally, we can also use this structure to direct our models towards asking questions and discovering new concepts. We have only just scratched the surface of what is possible and is not possible with graph representations and models. There are numerous open questions that still need to be investigated, including how robust are scene graph models to errors and noise? How can we extend them to include hierarchies and multi-object relationships? How can we use similar representations to decompose human interactions with images, videos, and even diagrams? And finally, can we provide new forms of explainable AI that uses explicit decomposition to produce counterfactual explanations? And of course, we also should be studying how can we deploy systems to incorporate new knowledge by interacting with people and learning from those interactions. Now, there's been a lot of success in understanding this underlying representation, and I hope that we begin to use those representations for other modalities as well, like diagrams. So I want to end by acknowledging my advisors, Fei-Fei Li and Michael Bernstein, and all of my collaborators and students who have really made this work possible. Thank you so much.